Good evening, and welcome back to Footnotes Folly. I am Professor Reginald St. John Pemberton, and tonight we reach Book 4 of the Annals of Tacitus, the years 23 to 28, and the point where the whole reign begins to rot from within. We give it to you complete, in plain modern English, from Thomas Gordon's grand old public domain translation. The plain rendering and the asides are my own. This is the book of Sejanus, the cold, capable, monstrously ambitious commander of the Praetorian Guard, who becomes the emperor's right hand and then begins, quietly, to reach for the throne itself. In this first part you will see him draw the scattered guard into one great camp at the gates of Rome, murder the emperor's own son Drusus with poison and patience, and turn the treason courts into an engine of terror. And you will see, in the trial of the historian Cremutius Cordus, one of the noblest defences of free speech ever spoken just before his books are thrown on the fire. Tacitus, a historian himself, never wrote anything with more feeling. Let us begin.
When Caius Asinius and Caius Antistius were consuls, Tiberius was in his 9th year as ruler. The state was quiet, and his own family seemed secure and flourishing, for he counted the death of Germanicus as one of the events that favored his fortune. Then, suddenly, fortune began to turn violent, and Tiberius either began to act as a tyrant himself, or to give others the means to practice tyranny for him. The beginning and cause of this change came from Aelius Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian cohorts. I have already mentioned his power. Now I will explain his origin, his character, and the wicked acts by which he tried to seize supreme rule. Sejanus was born at Volsinii, the son of Segistrabo, a Roman knight. In his early youth he followed Caius Caesar, the grandson of Augustus, and at that time carried the disgraceful reputation of having sold himself to the lust of Apicius, a wealthy and extravagant debauchee. Later, by many different artifices, he so captivated Tiberius that the prince, who was obscure and unreadable to everyone else, became entirely open and unguarded with Sejanus alone. Yet Sejanus did not achieve this by any extraordinary skill in policy, for others later defeated him by his own kinds of stratagems, but rather through the anger of the gods against the Roman state, to which he brought destruction both when he rose and when he fell. His body was tough and equal to hardship, his spirit was bold but hidden. He worked carefully to conceal his own designs, and was clever at blackening the designs of others. He could be equally flattering and domineering. Outwardly he appeared perfectly modest, while inwardly he nourished a passion for domination. To advance that ambition he sometimes gave himself to extravagance, gifts and luxury. At other times he displayed application and watchfulness. These qualities were no less dangerous when ambition put them on as a mask in order to acquire empire. The authority of his command over the guards had been moderate before his time, but he enlarged it by bringing into one camp all the Praetorian cohorts that had previously been scattered through the city. In this way, being united, they could all receive his orders at once, and by constantly seeing their own numbers and strength, they would gain confidence in themselves and become a terror to everyone else. The soldiers, while they live scattered, live loosely and corruptly. When gathered into one body, their help can be trusted more in any sudden emergency, and when they are encamped away from the temptations of the town, their discipline will be stricter and more severe. When the camp was finished, Sejanus began gradually to win the soldiers' affection by every form of friendliness, courtship, and familiar treatment. He himself chose the centurions, and he himself chose the tribunes. Nor did the Senate escape his ambitions. By distinguishing his followers there with offices and provinces, he built influence and a faction among them. Tiberius yielded completely to all this, and was even so devoted to Sejanus that not only in private conversation, but publicly, in speeches to the Senate and people, he described and praised him as the sharer of his burdens. He even allowed images of Sejanus to be publicly adored in the several theatres, in all places of popular assembly, and even among the eagles of the legions. But many obstacles stood in the way of Sejanus's designs. The imperial house was full of Caesars. The emperor's son was a grown man, and his grandsons were old enough to matter. Since it was dangerous to cut them all off at once, the treason Sejanus planned required a gradual series of murders. He chose the darkest method, and decided to begin with Drusus, against whom he had a new cause of rage. Drusus, impatient of a rival and fiery by nature, had in some accidental quarrel shaken his fist at Sejanus, and when Sejanus prepared to resist, Drusus struck him in the face. As Sejanus considered every possible means of revenge, the easiest seemed to be an approach to Livia, Drusus's wife. She was the sister of Germanicus, and though she had been unattractive in childhood, she later grew to surpass others in beauty. Since Sejanus desired her violently, he tempted her into adultery. Once the first crime was completed, for a woman who has sacrificed her chastity will hardly stop at anything else, he led her on to greater designs, marriage, a partnership in the empire, and even the murder of her husband. Thus she, the niece of Augustus, the daughter-in-law of Tiberius, and the mother of children by Drusus, defiled herself, her ancestors, and her descendants with a municipal adulterer, all in order to exchange an honorable condition already possessed for criminal and uncertain hopes. Eudemus, Livia's physician, was admitted as a partner in the guilt, and under cover of his profession he was often with her in private. Sejanus also dismissed Apicata, his wife, from his bed, the woman by whom he had 3 children, so that the adulteress would not be jealous. Yet the greatness of the crime frightened them, and from that fear came caution, delays, and often conflicting plans. Meanwhile, at the beginning of the year, Drusus, one of the sons of Germanicus, put on the manly robe, and the Senate granted him the same honors it had previously decreed to his brother Nero. Tiberius added a speech with high praise of his own son. With the tenderness of a father, he treats the children of his brother. For Drusus, though it is rare for power and harmony to exist together, was considered kindly, and certainly not hostile toward these youths. Tiberius now revived once more the proposal that he should travel through the provinces, an old proposal, always empty, but often pretended. He claimed that many veterans had been discharged, making it necessary to recruit the armies, that volunteers were lacking, or if any were found, they were mostly needy wanderers, without the same modesty and courage. He also briefly recounted the number of the legions and the countries they defended, a detail that I think I too should repeat, so it may appear what the Roman forces then amounted to, what kings were their allies, and how much narrower the limits of the empire were. Italy was protected on both sides by 2 fleets, one at Misenum and one at Ravenna. The coast next to Gaul was guarded by the galleys Augustus had captured at the Battle of Actium and sent, strongly manned, to forage Julium. But the chief military strength was on the Rhine, where 8 legions served as a common defense against the Germans and the Gauls. Spain, whose conquest had recently been completed, was held by 3 legions. Mauritania was ruled by King Juba, a kingdom he possessed as a gift from the Roman people. The rest of Africa was held by 2 legions, and Egypt by the same number. 4 legions kept under control the vast stretch of territory running from the borders nearest Syria as far as the Euphrates, and touching the Iberians, Albanians, and other principalities, who were protected by our power against foreign powers. Thrace was held by Rometalses and the sons of Codus. Both banks of the Danube were guarded by 4 legions, 2 in Pannonia and 2 in Moesia. 2 more were stationed in Dalmatia. Because of the position of that country, they were close enough to support the others, and would not have far to march into Italy if sudden help were needed there. Rome also had troops of her own, 3 city cohorts and 9 praetorian cohorts, recruited chiefly from Etruria and Umbria, or from ancient Latium and the old Roman colonies. In the several provinces, according to local need and position, were also stationed the fleets of the allies, with their cavalry squadrons and infantry battalions. These forces were not much fewer than all the rest, but a precise account would be uncertain, since, as circumstances required, they often changed stations, and their numbers were sometimes increased and sometimes reduced. This seems the proper place to review the other parts of the administration, and the methods by which it had so far been conducted, until, at the beginning of this year, the government of Tiberius began to grow worse. Until then, all public affairs and every important private matter were decided by the Senate. He allowed the leading men freedom of debate, and checked those who slipped into flattery. In giving offices, he was guided by merit, ancient nobility, reputation won in war abroad, and civil abilities shown at home, so that it was clear he could not have made better choices. The consuls and praetors still retained the useful marks of their rank. Lower magistrates exercised their offices independently. The laws, except where the power of the prince was involved, remained in proper force. The tributes, duties, and all public revenues were managed by companies of Roman knights. The administration of his own revenue he entrusted only to men of the best, known qualifications, most of them personally known to him, though some were known only by reputation. Once appointed, they were kept in office without any fixed term, and many grew old in the same employments. The common people did suffer from a shortage of provisions, but through no fault of the prince. In fact, he spared neither expense nor effort to repair the effects of barren seasons on land and shipwrecks at sea. He took care that the provinces should not be burdened with new taxes, and that magistrates should use neither extortion nor violence in collecting the old ones. There were no disgraceful corporal punishments and no confiscations of goods. The emperor's estates throughout Italy were few. His slaves behaved modestly, and the freedmen who managed his household were not numerous. In disputes between him and private persons, the courts were open and the law was equal. He observed all these restraints, not from courtesy or any wish to be popular, but always sternly, and usually in a frightening manner. Still, he did observe them until the death of Drusus, when they were abandoned. While Drusus lived, they continued, because Sejanus, while still laying the foundations of his power, tried to commend himself by giving good advice. He also had an avenger to fear, a man who did not hide his hostility and often complained of him. When the son is in the prime of life, another man is called in as an assistant in the government. Indeed, how little is lacking before he is declared a colleague in the empire. The first steps toward sovereignty are steep and dangerous, but once a man has entered them, parties and instruments are ready to support him. Already a camp for the guards has been built by the pleasure and authority of their captain. The soldiers have been delivered into his hands. In the theater of Pompey his statue is seen. In his grandchildren, the blood of the Drusi will be mixed with that of Sejanus. After all this, what remains but to beg his modesty to be content? These complaints were not rare, nor were they made only to a few people. Besides, since his wife had been corrupted, all his secrets were betrayed. Sejanus therefore decided it was time to kill him, and chose a poison that would work gradually, so that the death might still look like the result of an ordinary illness. It was given to Drusus by Lyctus the eunuch, as was learned 8 years later. Throughout all the days of his illness, Tiberius showed no signs of grief, perhaps from a display of firmness of spirit. Even after Drusus had died, and while he still lay unburied, Tiberius entered the Senate. Seeing the consuls placed on an ordinary seat as a sign of their grief, he reminded them of their dignity and rank. When the senators broke into tears, he suppressed his own rising sighs and strengthened them with a speech delivered without hesitation. I am not unaware that I may be censured for coming before the Senate in the first blows of sorrow, when most people, under the fresh pains of mourning, can hardly endure the consolations of their relatives and can hardly bear the light of day. Nor should such people be condemned for weakness. But for myself, I have stronger consolations, drawn from embracing the commonwealth and pursuing her welfare. I lament the extreme age of my mother, the tender years of my grandsons, and the decline of my own days. As the only relief for our present troubles, I ask that the children of Germanicus be brought in. The consuls therefore went to fetch them, and after strengthening their young minds with kind words, presented them to the emperor. He took them by the hand and spoke again. Conscript fathers, these infants, deprived of their father, I entrusted to their uncle. I begged him, though he had children of his own, to rear and nourish them no differently than if they were the immediate offspring of his blood, and to adopt them as supports for himself and his posterity. Now that Drusus has been snatched from us, I address the same prayers to you. In the presence of the gods, before the face of your country, I call on you to receive into your protection and take under your care the great grandchildren of Augustus, children descended from the most glorious ancestors in the state. Toward them, fulfill your own duty and fulfill mine. To you, Nero, to you, Drusus, these senators stand in the place of a father. Such is the condition of your birth that every good and every evil that happens to you must fall upon the commonwealth. All this was heard with much weeping, and was followed by favorable prayers and vows. If he had stopped there, and kept his speech within proper bounds, he would have left his hearers full of sympathy and approval. But he revived an old scheme, always impossible and often mocked, about restoring the republic and putting it back into the hands of the consuls, or of anyone else who would take up the government. By doing this, he destroyed trust even in the parts of his statement that were worthy and sincere. The same honors were decreed for the memory of Drusus as had been decreed for Germanicus, with many more added, in keeping with the spirit of flattery, which loves variety and improvement. The funeral was especially splendid because of the long procession of ancestral images. In that grand train appeared Aeneas, father of the Julian race, all the kings of Alba, Romulus, founder of Rome, then the Sabine nobility, Atus Clausus, and his descendants of the Claudian family. In telling of the death of Drusus, I have followed most of our historians, and the most trustworthy ones. Still, I will not omit a rumor that was so common in those days that it has not disappeared even in our own. It was said that Sejanus, after winning Livia over to murder through adultery, had also secured the affection and cooperation of the eunuch Lyctus through unnatural corruption. Lyctus, because of his youth and beauty, was dear to his master and one of his principal attendants. When the conspirators had settled the time and place for the poisoning, the eunuch grew bold enough to accuse Drusus of plotting to poison Tiberius. He secretly warned the emperor of this, and advised him to avoid the first cup offered to him at the next banquet with his son. The old man, possessed by this invented treason, sat down at table, received the cup, and handed it to Drusus, who drank it off unknowingly and cheerfully. This, the rumor claimed, increased the jealousy and fear of Tiberius, as if his son, through fear and shame, had swallowed the same death that he had prepared for his father. These popular stories are unsupported by any reliable author, and they can easily be refuted. What man of ordinary prudence, much less Tiberius, so long trained in great affairs, would give deadly poison to his own son without first hearing him, and with his own hands too, thereby cutting off forever every chance of drawing back? Why would he not instead have tortured the servant who carried the poison? Why would he not have investigated the person who planned it? Why would he not have shown toward his only son, a son not yet convicted of any crime, the slowness and hesitation that were natural to him even in his proceedings against strangers? But because Sejanus was thought to be the author of every wicked act, the excessive fondness of Tiberius for him, and the hatred everyone else felt toward them both, made people believe the most fabulous and terrible things about them. Besides, common rumor is always most filled with dreadful tales when princes die. In truth, the design and course of the murder were first discovered by Apicata, wife of Sejanus, and were revealed under torture by Eudemus and Lyctus. No writer has appeared so extreme as to charge it upon Tiberius, although in other matters they have carefully gathered and exaggerated every one of his actions. My purpose in recounting and rejecting this rumor is to destroy, by so clear an example, the credit of groundless tales, and to ask those into whose hands this work may come not to prefer hearsay, empty of credibility and rashly accepted, over accounts of truth that are not corrupted by romance. To continue, while Tiberius was publicly delivering the funeral praise of his son, the Senate and people took on the look and voice of mourners, more in appearance than from the heart. Inwardly they rejoiced to see the house of Germanicus beginning to revive. But this first appearance of better fortune, and the conduct of Agrippina, who poorly concealed her hopes, hastened the ruin of that house. Sejanus saw that the death of Drusus had gone unavenged upon his murderers, and that no public grief had followed it. Bold in wickedness, because his first attempts had succeeded, he began to consider how he might destroy the sons of Germanicus, whose succession to the empire was now beyond doubt. There were 3 of them, and because their guardians were notably faithful, and Agrippina was incorruptibly chaste, they could not all be reached by poison. He therefore chose another way to attack her. He would raise alarms from the pride and stubbornness of her temper. He would stir up the old hatred of Livia the elder, and the guilty mind of his recent accomplice, Livia the younger, so that they might describe her to the emperor as swollen with the credit and fame of her fruitfulness, and as trusting in that, and in the zeal of the populace, while stretching out eager hands toward the empire. The young Livia used crafty slanderers in this effort. Among them she had especially chosen Julius Postumus, a man well suited to her purposes, because he was the adulterer of Mutilia Prisca and therefore a confidant of her grandmother's. Prisca had great influence over the mind of the empress. Through these means the old woman, who by nature was tenderly attached to power and anxious for it, was made utterly irreconcilable to the widow of her grandson. Those closest to Agrippina were also encouraged to keep inflaming her stormy spirit with perverse reports. This year also brought embassies from Greek cities, one from the people of Samos, and one from those of Cus. The first asked that the ancient rite of sanctuary in the temple of Juno be confirmed. The second asked the same confirmation for the sanctuary of Aesculapius. The Samians based their claim on a decree of the Council of Amphictyons, the supreme court of Greece, from the time when the Greeks, through the cities they founded in Asia, held the seacoasts. The people of Cus had no weaker claim from antiquity, and their place also had the additional claim of friendship with Rome. They had sheltered in the temple of Aesculapius all the Roman citizens who were there when, by order of King Mithridates, Roman citizens were slaughtered throughout all the cities of Asia and the islands. And now, after many complaints from the praetors, most of them ineffective, the emperor at last made a report to the Senate about the license of the players. He said that in many cases they stirred up seditious disturbances and violated the public peace, and in many others encouraged debauchery in private families. The Oscan farce, once only the contemptible amusement of the common people, had risen to such a powerful level of popularity and excess that it required the authority of the Senate to restrain it. The players were therefore driven out of Italy. The same year brought the death of one of Drusus's twin sons, and with it fresh grief for the emperor. He was also deeply hurt by the death of a close friend, Lucilius Longus, who had been the constant companion of every change in his fortune, happy or unhappy. Of all the senators, Lucilius Longus alone had gone with him into retirement at Rhodes. For that reason, though he was only a new man, the Senate voted him a public funeral and ordered a statue of him to be set up at public expense in the square of Augustus. At that time, all public business was still conducted through the Senate. So when Lucilius Capito, the emperor's comptroller in Asia, was accused by the province, he was brought before the Senate to defend himself. On that occasion the emperor declared with great seriousness that Lucilius Capito had received from him no authority except over his slaves and the collection of his private rents. If Lucilius Capito had taken on the jurisdiction of a praetor and used military force, then he had exceeded his orders. The Senate, therefore, should hear the complaints of the province. The accused man was tried and condemned. In gratitude for this just punishment, and for the punishment inflicted the year before on Caius Silanus, the cities of Asia voted to build a temple to Tiberius, his mother, and the Senate, and they received permission to do so. Nero then delivered a speech of thanks to the senators and to his grandfather. His speech delighted his hearers. Their minds were still full of Germanicus, and they imagined that they were hearing Germanicus and seeing Germanicus before them. The young man himself also had an attractive modesty and a grace suited to a prince. These qualities became even dearer and more admired because of the well-known hatred that threatened him from Sejanus. I know that many of the events I have already related, and many that I shall relate hereafter, may perhaps seem small and too trivial to record. But no one should compare these annals of mine with the works of those who wrote the history of the ancient Roman people. Their subjects were mighty wars, powerful cities taken by storm, and great kings defeated and captured. Even when they turned to Rome's domestic affairs, they found the rivalries and hostilities of consuls and tribunes, the agrarian and fermentary laws urged and resisted, and the long struggles between the nobles and the populace. These were large and noble subjects, both at home and abroad, and the old historians had ample space and freedom in recounting them. My task is narrow and without glory. I have to describe settled peace, or only brief intervals of war, affairs at Rome that are sorrowful and distressing, and a prince who did not care to extend the empire. Yet it will still be useful to look closely into such events, because matters that at first appear small often give rise in motion to great events. All nations and cities are governed either by the populace, by the nobility, or by single rulers. A form of government chosen and blended from all three is easier to praise than to establish, and even if it is established, it cannot last long. Therefore, during the Republic, whether the power of the people prevailed or the Senate held the chief authority, it was necessary to understand the temper of the common people and the ways they could be humored and restrained. Those who thoroughly knew the spirit of the Senate and of the leading men were considered skilled in the times and men of ability. Now that the old system has been changed, and the present condition is as if one man ruled everything, it is useful to collect and record these later incidents as examples and instruction for public life. Few people can, by their own wisdom, distinguish crooked things from upright ones, or harmful advice from profitable advice. Most are taught by the fate of others. Still, this kind of narrative, however instructive, gives little pleasure. Readers are engaged and refreshed by descriptions of nations, by varied battles, and by the brave deaths of famous captains. I can offer only the sad spectacle of cruel orders, constant accusations, faithless friendships, the ruin of innocent people, and endless trials, all ending in the same way, with death and condemnation. This creates an obvious cycle of repetition and weariness. Besides, the old historians are rarely criticized, and no one now cares whether they chiefly exalt the Roman or Carthaginian armies. But many who under Tiberius suffered punishment, or were marked with disgrace, still have descendants living. Even where the families themselves have died out, others are found who, because their characters resemble those condemned, think that when another man's evil deeds are recounted, they themselves are being accused. Even virtue and a glorious name create enemies, because they show opposite characters too plainly. But I return to my subject. While Cornelius Cassius and Asinius Agrippa were consuls, Cremutius Cordus was brought to trial because, in the Annals he had published, he had praised Brutus and called Cassius the last of the Romans. This was a new crime, created then for the first time. His accusers were Satrius Secundus and Pinarius Nata, dependents of Sejanus, which was a deadly omen for the accused. Tiberius also received his defense with a face fixed in cruelty. Cremutius Cordus, abandoning all hope of life, began in this way. As to actions, conscript fathers, I am so innocent that only my words are accused. Yet no words of mine are aimed against the emperor or his mother, the only persons included in the law concerning violated majesty. I am said to have praised Brutus and Cassius, men whose lives and actions have been written by a multitude of authors, and whose memory no one has treated except with honor. Titus Livius, a historian especially famous for eloquence and truth, praised Pompey so abundantly that Augustus called him Pompeianus, yet this did not damage their friendship. Neither Scipio, nor Afranius, nor even the same Cassius, nor the same Brutus, is anywhere described by him as traitors and parricides, the common names now thrown at them, but often as great and memorable men. The writings of Asinius Pollio have handed down the memory of the same men under honorable descriptions. Corvinus Messala gloried in having had Cassius for his general, and yet both Pollio and Corvinus became notably powerful in wealth and honors under Augustus. Cicero's book, in which he raised Cato to the skies, drew from Caesar the dictator no punishment except a written reply, composed in the same style and on equal terms, as if Caesar were answering before judges. The letters of Mark Antony and the speeches of Brutus are full of reproaches and countercharges against Augustus, false indeed, but pressed with marked bitterness. The poems of Bibaculus and those of Catullus, packed with fierce satires against the Caesars, are still read. Yet even the deified Julius and the deified Augustus endured all these attacks and disdained them. Whether they showed greater moderation or wisdom, I cannot easily say. For if such attacks are despised, they fade away. If you grow angry, you seem to admit that they are just. I give no examples from the Greeks. Among them, not only freedom of speech but even excess in speech goes unpunished. If anyone answers it, he answers words with words. It has always been allowed, without limit or reprimand, to judge those whom death has placed beyond the reach of love and hatred. Are Cassius and Brutus now under arms? Do they now fill the fields of Philippi with troops? Am I inflaming the Roman people with speeches meant to stir up civil war? Brutus and Cassius have been dead for more than 70 years, yet they are still known by their statues, which even their conqueror did not destroy. If statues may show their faces, why may a historian not show their characters? Fair posterity gives every man the praise that belongs to him. If my death is decided, there will be people who revive not only the memory of Cassius and Brutus, but mine as well. After saying this, Cremutius Cordus left the Senate and ended his life by refusing food. The fathers ordered his books to be burned by the aediles, but copies survived, hidden and spread about. This gives good reason to laugh at the foolishness of those who think that present power can extinguish the light and memory of later ages. In fact, punishment of writers increases the reputation of their writings. Foreign kings, and all others who have tried it, have gained nothing from it except disgrace for themselves and glory for those who suffered. To continue, throughout the whole year there was such a constant flood of accusations that even during the solemn Latin festival, when Drusus had gone up to the tribunal for his inauguration as governor of Rome, Calpurnius Salvianus approached him with a charge against Sextus Marius. The emperor openly resented this, and Salvianus was therefore banished. Next, the city of Cyzicus was accused of failing to maintain the established worship of the deified Augustus. Other charges were added, including violence committed against some Roman citizens. For this the city lost the liberties it had earned by its conduct in the Mithridatic War, when it had endured a siege, and by its own courage as much as by the help of Lucullus, had driven back the king. But Fonteius Capito, who had governed Asia as proconsul, was acquitted when it was proved that the crimes brought against him by Sejanus were fabricated. Yet Sejanus suffered no punishment for the false charge. Public hatred made him safer. The more eager and relentless an accuser was, the more sacred and untouchable he became. Only the weak and helpless were handed over for punishment. About the same time, further Spain sent ambassadors to ask the Senate for permission to build a temple to Tiberius and his mother, following the example of Asia. This gave the emperor, who was always firm in rejecting honors, a chance to answer those who exposed him to popular criticism by saying that he had drifted into ambition. I know, conscript fathers, that people generally blamed me and called it weakness when I did not oppose the cities of Asia, after they asked for this same thing. I will therefore explain both why I was silent then and what rule I am resolved to follow in the future. Since the deified Augustus had not opposed the founding at Pergamus of a temple to himself and to the city of Rome, I followed an example already approved, because all his actions and words have the force of law for me. I did so more readily because the worship offered to me was joined with worship of the Senate. But while allowing this once may be pardoned, a general freedom to be worshipped in every province under sacred images of the deities would show a vain spirit and a heart swollen with ambition. The glory of Augustus, too, will disappear if it is cheapened by the indiscriminate courting of flatterers. As for myself, conscript fathers, I am a mortal man. I am confined to the duties of human nature, and it is enough for me if I properly fill the chief place among you. I say this openly to you, and I want posterity to remember it. They will do full justice to my memory, if they believe that I was worthy of my ancestors, watchful over the Roman state, steady in dangers, and in maintaining the public interest, unafraid of private enmities. These are the temples I would raise in your hearts. These are the fairest images, and the ones that will last. Temples and statues of stone, if the person worshipped in them comes to be hated by posterity, are despised like his tombs. So I here call upon the gods to grant me, to the end of my life, a mind undisturbed and able to discern both human and divine duties. And I also beg our citizens and allies, whenever my death comes, to remember my actions with approval and kindly testimony, and to preserve the fragrance of my name. From then on, Tiberius continued on every occasion, even in private conversation, to reject this divine worship of himself. Some attributed this behavior to modesty, many to conscious insecurity, and others to a low spirit. They argued that the greatest men naturally desire the highest honors. Among the Greeks, Hercules and Bacchus had been added to the company of the gods, and among the Romans so had Romulus. Augustus, too, had chosen the nobler course and hoped for deification. All other satisfactions of princes were obtained immediately. One alone had to be pursued without limit, the praise and lasting survival of their name. By scorning fame, they said, a man scorned the virtues that create it. Now, Sejanus was drunk with excessive fortune. He was also urged on by Livia, who, with a woman's restless passion, longed for the marriage that had been promised. He therefore prepared a written petition to the emperor, for at that time it was customary to address him in writing even when he was present. Sejanus wrote that Augustus had shown him such kindness, and Tiberius afterward so many marks of affection, that he had grown used to carrying his hopes and prayers directly to the emperors without first applying to the gods. Yet he had never sought a blaze of honors from them. His choice and ambition had been the watches and hardships of common soldiers, undertaken for the safety of the prince. Still, he had gained what was most glorious for him, to be thought worthy of alliance with the emperor. From this came his present hopes. Since he had heard that Augustus, when arranging a husband for his daughter, had considered even some Roman knights, he begged that, if a husband were being sought for Livia, Tiberius would remember his friend, a man whose ambition aimed no higher than the pure and unselfish honor of that connection. He said he would never abandon the burden of his present office, but would think it enough, by this means, to be able to support his house against the unjust anger of Agrippina, and in this he was thinking only of the safety of his children. As for himself, his life would be long enough whenever it finally ended in the service of such a prince. For the moment, Tiberius praised the loyalty of Sejanus, briefly reviewed the favors he had already shown him, and asked for time, as if he needed to think the matter through fully. At last he gave his answer. All other men may shape their plans by what is convenient for them, but the position of princes is very different. In everything they do, they must think first about the approval and goodwill of the public. So I will not mislead Sejanus with an easy, plausible answer. Livia can decide for herself whether, after Drusus, she ought to marry again or remain his widow, and she has a mother and grandmother who are nearer to her and more directly concerned in advising her. But I will deal more plainly with you. First, as to the hostility of Agrippina, it would burst out with new violence if, through Livia's marriage, the family of the Caesars were split into two rival parties. Even now the rivalry of these women often breaks out openly, and their quarrels pull my grandsons in different directions. What would happen if such a marriage set that conflict on fire? You are mistaken, Sejanus, if you think you could then remain in the same rank you hold now, or if you think Livia, who was first the wife of the young Caius Caesar and afterward the wife of Drusus, would be willing to grow old with a husband no higher than a Roman knight. Suppose I even allowed you afterward to remain what you are. Do you believe that those who saw her father, her brother, and the ancestors of our house covered with the highest honors would ever accept it? You say you intend to stay in the same position. But the great magistrates and nobles of the state, the very men who force themselves on you against your will and consult you in every affair as if you were their oracle, openly say that you have long since passed the limits of the equestrian order and have far exceeded in power all the confidants of my father. Because they hate you, they also criticize me. Yet it is said that Augustus considered giving his daughter to a Roman knight. Why should that surprise anyone? Burdened by countless cares and aware how high above others he raised any man whom he honored with such a marriage, he spoke of Proculeius and men like him, notable for their private way of life and in no way involved in affairs of state. But if we are influenced by the hesitation of Augustus, how much more should we be influenced by his final decision, since he gave his daughter first to Agrippa, and then to me? These are considerations that, as your friend, I have not concealed from you. Still, neither your own wishes, nor those of Livia shall ever be crossed by me. For now I will not describe the secret and steady purposes I have in my heart toward you, or what further ties of kinship I am planning in order to bind you still more closely to me. I will say only this. There is no height so great that your abilities, and your exceptional zeal and loyalty toward me, may not justly claim it. When the opportunity comes, either in Senate or before a popular assembly, I will not fail to declare it. After this answer, Sejanus no longer pressed for the marriage. But his fears had grown larger, and he begged Tiberius to resist hidden suspicions, to disregard the chatter of the crowd, and not to listen to the hostile breath of envy. He was also troubled by the crowds that constantly filled his house. If he kept them away, he might weaken his own power. If he encouraged them, he might give his enemies grounds for accusations. He therefore decided that he would urge the emperor to leave Rome, and spend his life far from the city in pleasant retirement. From this plan Sejanus foresaw many advantages. All access to the emperor would depend on him. Since soldiers carried the letters and messages, almost all communications would be under his control. In a short time the prince, already in declining age and then softened by seclusion, would more readily hand over to him the whole burden of the empire. Sejanus would also be removed from the multitude of people who came to court him at Rome, and one cause of envy would be cut off. By giving up the empty appearances of power, he would increase its real substance. So, little by little, he began to complain about the rush of business at Rome, the crowds of people, and the swarms of petitioners. He praised retirement and quiet, where away from tiresome burdens and free from private complaints and resentments, all important affairs could best be handled. Next, ambassadors from the Lacedaemonians and Messenians were heard about the right each people claimed to the temple of Diana Limnates. The Lacedaemonians asserted that it belonged to them because it had been founded in their territory and dedicated by their ancestors. As proof, they offered the ancient authority of their records and the hymns of the old poets. They said it had indeed been taken from them by the superior force of Philip of Macedon when they were at war with him, but that it had afterward been restored by the judicial decision of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. The Messenians, on the other hand, relied on the ancient division of Peloponnesus among the descendants of Hercules. From that division, they said, the territory where the temple stood had fallen to their king, and monuments of that allotment still remained, engraved on stone and old bronze tablets. If histories and poets were to be used as witnesses, they claimed that they had the greater number and the fuller evidence. Nor, they said, had Philip acted from mere power in making his decision, but from justice. The same judgment had afterward been given by King Antigonus, and the same by the Roman commander Mummius. The Milesians, chosen as arbitrators by both sides, had also decided this way, and finally Attidius Geminus, praetor of Achaia, had determined it so. The Messenians therefore won the case. The citizens of Segistum also applied on behalf of the temple of Venus on Mount Eryx, which had fallen into decay through age, and asked that it be restored. They set out the story of its origin and antiquity, a form of flattery pleasing to Tiberius, who willingly took the charge upon himself as a kinsman of the goddess. Then the petition of the citizens of Marseille was discussed, and the claim they made according to the precedent of Publius Rutilius was approved. Rutilius, though expelled from Rome by law, had been adopted as a citizen by the people of Smyrna. In the same way, Vulcatius Macius, another exile, had found the same privilege and reception at Marseille, and had left his estate to their republic as to his own country.
And there we will pause. Sejanus has murdered an heir, mastered the courts, and now dares to ask for the hand of a princess of the imperial house a step from the purple itself. Tiberius answers him with a masterpiece of evasion, neither yes nor no. Next time, in part 2, the scene widens to the troubled provinces, and then narrows to a single fateful moment in a collapsing cave, the moment that decides the emperor to do the strangest thing of his whole reign: abandon Rome altogether. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.